All right, everybody, welcome back to the second video for this week, in which we will be talking about Buddhism during the Nara period and sort of the early history of Buddhism in Japan and magic. All right, so let me find my share thing again. All right, so we're back to the same outline, which, like I said, I will give to you guys at the beginning of next week, at the last week of the unit, so that way you have it for review purposes. Okay, so so Nara is a city that still exists in Japan. It's called Nara now. It wasn't called Nara then. But, so it's something that you have to know about Japanese capitals is prior to this time, each new emperor would kind of set up their own new capital in a villa that they established somewhere. And so the capital just kept moving around all over the place throughout the Asuka period, and especially prior to this establishment of I say semi-permanent because it was the first capital that lasted for more than one emperor. And it's similar to its design. Let's see if I can bring this up. For some reason, I couldn't find a plan for Nara. I guess I just didn't look hard enough. But it's similar to the what is called the Fujiwara capital, or Fujiwara Kyo in Japanese. And what's important about this is that this is the first capital that is modeled on the structure and the sort of layout of Chinese cities and Chinese capital cities. And there are a number of important elements I want to talk about here. First are the three mountains. You'll notice how there's a small mountain here. I mean, okay, I'm now just assuming that you can all read Chinese because many of you can. But anyway, so in Japanese, it does say that there's a small mountain here, there's a larger mountain here, and then there's a pretty big mountain here. You'll notice that the Fujiwara no Miya, so the Fuji, or the Fujiwara-gu, if you will, is situated in the dead center of the city, and then you have this grid layout for what are referred to as avenues here, and then streets this way. You have the major avenues, and then you have the minor avenues in between them, and then you have the major streets and the minor streets in between them. And then it is very clearly oriented in a north-south, west-east orientation. And then it's sort of in the center of these three mountains. This has to do with the fact that in this period in Japanese history, and also for quite a while, this will be true of the Heian period as well, there was a fervent belief in sort of like what is often called geomancy, which is this idea that sort of like magical properties result from like where things are situated on the land, in the earth, the geo, if you would, geomancy, so like literally like place magic or earth magic. And so the alignment of the Fujiwara capital, and then later the Nara capital as well, is designed to like cause, I guess you could say, benefits to accrue to the state as a result of like magical properties that accrue from like this particular alignment. It's strange. Like, I don't even understand that. Well, I'm just saying, like, hey, it's a thing. Why is this important for talking about Buddhism in this period? And then the Fujiwara capital is modeled on the ancient Chinese capital of Xi'an. Sorry, my Chinese pronunciation is bad. My Chinese is bad. You guys are just gonna have to get used to it. Why is this important? Because when we're talking about Buddhism in the Nara period, and basically Buddhism for the entirety of this class at least, often it's going to have magical properties. But what's really very different about Japanese Buddhism is that it was state controlled. And so it's, you have Buddhism plus magic, but the whole point of sort of Buddhist magic is that like Buddhism and the way it was understood in this period was as a way to sort of protect the nation state. And then this was directly related to sort of the early temple system. Prior to the Nara period, there were, quite a few, I mean, because, 552, that's well before 710. In the Nara period, prior to the Nara period, there were a decent number of temples, but the Emperor Shomu actually wanted to build an official, like, state-sanctioned temple in every single province in the country. And it's worth noting that in this period, in the Nara period, there was this, like, so many temples were built. Like, there was just this astronomical increase. And the goal was to have them function almost as like religious administration offices, but not administration probably in sort of the bureaucratic sense that we think today, but more like, again, sort of they're thinking in a sort of like geomantic sense. Like, you need to have a temple situated in each of the provinces so that way the Buddhism magic can emanate from all of the provinces and reach all of them. Because the primary purpose for doing this was to ensure plentiful, bountiful harvests and also to eliminate disease epidemics. So clearly what we need to be doing in these this time of COVID is to be building a bunch of Buddhist temples in every state in the US, because nothing else we seem to be doing seems to have any effect. Sorry about that. And this is this way of seeing Buddhism as kind of a magical practice has very clear, if not origins, like it's sort of like sympathetic with the way in which the native animistic sort of kami worship was understood as a way to sort of like maintain good relationships with the gods. That way the gods would ensure bountiful harvest, lack of disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the weirdness of that, and I want to talk about this temple that I showed you guys earlier, Toldaiji, which is the major Buddhist temple in Nara. In fact, it's still there. If you want to go see it, go see it. It's kind of cool. I don't know. It's kind of a long walk from the station. I don't particularly, I've been there. It's whatever. It's just whatever. So why is Toldaiji famous? Toldaiji was sort of like the central Buddhism administration building in this period. That's really why it was built. It was originally built as a sort of like the center point for like the constant, like, and there was even administrative offices that are housed in Toldaiji for all of these official provincial temples. So it's the idea is like, you can almost imagine this sort of like a system where, you know, there's a temple in each province and they're all sending their Buddhist energy. It's like that scene in oh god, this is a dated reference. So for those of you who have ever seen Dragon Ball Z, when Goku has the spirit bomb and everybody on Earth is like channeling their energy into the spirit bomb, it's very similar to what they're trying to do here. They want all of like the individual Buddhist temples in the provinces to channel their energy into sort of the main temple in Toldaiji. And sort of the focal point for this is this bronze statue of the Buddha. That's this guy right here. The Daibutsu, and then this area is called the part of the temple that it sits in is called the Daibutsu-den. Now this is an interesting statue for a number of reasons, not just because of its like function as sort of like a magical focus. It was called for by Emperor Shomu in 743. It was cast for the first time. Well, actually, it's not for the first time. The first successful cast, they actually tried to cast it, I think, 7 times before they got a successful one. So the first successful cast of the bronze part in 749, and then it was dedicated by Shomu's daughter, his successor, in 752. Now, what's there are a number of fascinating little anecdotes surrounding the great Buddha of Toldaiji. Number one is like it nearly bankrupted the country. Like this thing was so expensive to make. Now imagine like if the entire like GDP, the entire like imagine like 20% of all financial resources of your country went towards building a statue. That's really what happened in this period, because it used up almost the entirety of the country's reserves of gold and copper. The statue was only finished because a gold mine was discovered during the process of building and gilding it. And this was seen as a sign to Emperor Shomu that sort of the kami, the gods, that sort of the native gods were on board, because they had bestowed this mine generously upon them, even though, you know, as anyone who has studied geology knows, the mine was already there. They just found it. But aside from that sort of funny story about the way in which it nearly bankrupted the state, it's a really interesting symbol and a really sort of cool way of thinking about Japanese society at this time. So a thing that I want to notice. So So this part here is bronze. It's a bronze statue, and then this bit in the back around it is gold and gold leaf, and then the base that it sits on is lotus petals. And even though this is not physically true of the statue, the way in which it is described is as a single large Buddha sitting on 1,000 lotus leaves with 1,000 Buddhas emanating from them. And you can kind of see this. I mean, it's not like literally represented in this statue, but you see the Buddhas, you see the leaves, and this idea that sort of there's this central point, but then you have all these Buddhas and they're sort of like surrounding the main Buddha, and sort of you see like the little lines with these radiating lines like the sun, but also kind of like, pointing their Buddha energy into the main Buddha, and then you at the main Buddha, and he's got his spirit bomb forming it in his hand here, and he's about to shoot it out the front of the Daibutsu. No, but the idea is sort of then the statue itself functions as this focal point, like the main Buddha, the central Buddha, sort of then radiates out all until these little Buddhas who are on their own lotus leaf pedestals. You can kind of see that there. And that they sort of radiate throughout the universe and also throughout, the country, throughout the land. And so then the main Buddha, the one in the center, represents the centrality of the emperor and the state, and also in many ways the centrality of the temple of Todaiji. While the lotus leaves and the respective Buddhas sort of represent the many provinces and locales throughout the country that sort of are looking back and pointing back towards the original. In many ways, the Daibutsu at Todaiji is a kind of symbol of the way in which people were thinking about the relationship between the emperor and the state at this time. The other sort of major development in this period was a shift from the particular type of Buddha that was built, Vairocana, or Rushana as it's called in Japanese, as opposed to the Shaka Buddha or Shaka Muni, is because there was this shift in terms of like what kind of Buddhism was becoming more popular. And there are a number of ways in which this played out. So the primary school to which we're shifting in this period when the Daibutsu is being built is the Kegon school, which is not, okay, I have heavily influenced here, that's kind of wrong. More like associated with the Buddhist priest Gyoki, who was kind of like this itinerant wandering priest who was kind of a rebel initially until he eventually gained Emperor Shomu's favor. Why was he a rebel? Because, as I noted earlier, Buddhism in this period was state-sanctioned. You had state-sanctioned temples. There were literally like national laws governing what Buddhism was and wasn't, like what temples could and could not be built. But this couldn't really be effectively, I guess you could say, implemented or disciplined, precisely because like there were Buddhism sort of breaking out all over the place. And Gyoki is kind of indicative of this. Gyoki is a really interesting figure because he saw his purpose. He was really influential amongst the lower classes, actually. And he saw his purpose as kind of almost as like a guy who did public works. He actually built a lot of bridges in villages and between different areas. And so his idea is that sort of Buddhism is this thing that is supposed to serve the people. It almost has kind of a democratic flavor to it. And that appealed to Emperor Shomu for a couple of reasons. So Gyoki's original like democratic approach or egalitarian approach to Buddhist practice and sort of proliferating the religion throughout the country appealed to the emperor for a couple of reasons. The first one was its universalism, which is to say that this was, so from Gyoki's perspective, that universalism meant that this is a religion that is available to everybody. From the emperor's perspective, that also meant that it was a religion that could be imposed upon everybody. And then also the other major important aspect of this is its humanistic focus, which is to say that It offers a form of personal salvation, meaning that instead of sort of like purging yourself of sinful behavior and creating expectations of not doing wrong in the first place, you have this religion that says like, well, you can be sinful and sinful things can happen, and then you can purge yourself, you can receive forgiveness for those sins later on. So it's kind of like, no, it's not like, but it's similar to Christianity in that respect. But again, we see the way in which sort of there's the bottom up perspective. So you have the bottom up perspective on universalism, which is to say the religion is available to all. But then you have the top down perspective, which is to say that its availability means that you can then impose it upon everybody. Same thing here. So the bottom up perspective would say that, okay, like this is available to anyone, anybody can be saved. And so it's very similar to like, evangelical Christianity in the West. But also it means that from a top-down perspective, if you think of sort of like the emperor's like patriarchal duty to the state, it means that like everyone should be saved by imposing this religion upon them. And so then it's seen as, again, in these terms of like protecting the country, like defending the country, like Buddhism is this thing that will make sure that everybody is safe and that everything functions harmoniously. The other major sort of Buddhist thing going on in this period is usually referred to as mountain asceticism, or Sanrin Bukkyo, which is like mountain ascetic Buddhism. Just remember mountain asceticism; it's fine. This is another example of a kind of Buddhist practice that actually flourished outside of this sort of the sanctioned state temple system, and it was especially influential amongst the landed gentry and the lower classes. And I point this out now because it will have very serious political ramifications later on. The mountain temples and their relative independence from sort of the state and the state's religious system will create a power base there that causes a lot of problems for the imperial family, basically for the rest of the history of the country, at least until the Edo period. And once again, we have another example of this sort of this Buddhism plus magic. While on the one hand, Kegon and sort of as embodied in someone like Gyoki was more like public service oriented, like, bringing religion to the masses to sort of save them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mountain ascetics believed that you sort of studied like esoteric teachings and you developed personal disciplines so as to acquire magical powers. Yes, it's this idea of like, oh, I'm going to go to the mountain monastery and I'm going to study Buddhism so that way I can become a superhero, basically, quite literally. And these mountain priests would often sort of demonstrate the power of their religion by traveling down to villages, to and fro, working miracles by like healing sick people or like performing like feats of strength as a way to sort of like spread belief and to gain followers. So this is like, yeah, literally. So it's like Buddhist superheroes is what they thought of themselves as, and that they acquired their magic powers through their religious discipline. And as a result of sort of all of this, and this is sort of the point I want to end on, is that many scholars, it's kind of a consensus. I don't know how much I agree with it. But a lot of people would argue that sort of kami worship, so early kami worship in Japan, predisposed the people of the islands to receive Buddhism in magical terms rather than as a kind of ethical philosophy. And what they're referring to here is this debate within religious studies that you often see, which is to question whether or not Buddhism as practiced is even a religion in the first place. Some prefer to think of Buddhism as a kind of ethical practice, a way of life, rather than a religion. And I don't know, I tend to be on that side. A little bit, because one of the major problems that you run into historically is, things like this, where there literally were people who studied Buddhism and sort of adhered to a particular belief because they thought it had certain supernatural properties. It wasn't just sort of an alternative psychology. It wasn't a way of sort of like therapeutically understanding how to behave in the world and how to order your mind correctly so that way, trials and tribulations don't cause as much concern. They literally thought that like if I, if I, worship the Buddha and then I read the sutras and I do my daily practice, I will eventually be able to beat up 1,000 men at the same time. So that was a thing that actually happened in his. I'm not saying that they actually had magical powers. I don't really know if they actually had magical powers. But people really did believe that if you adhered to Buddhist belief and that you sort of revered Siddhartha and his lotus posture, et cetera, that you really could acquire these magical powers. So, like I said, that's kind of something you have to grapple with. Anyway, that's all for this week. I will have the assignment posted shortly. Well, I mean, okay, shortly for me because I'm thinking of this in real time. You're probably going to be watching this sometime later in the week. Anyway, that's all for this week. Let's get out of this stupid screen share. I will see you all next week, in which we will talk about poetry. Well, actually, I guess I'll first see you on Wednesday. But then next week, we'll be talking about some poetry. We'll be talking about some history writing, particularly some sort of like mythological, legendary stories. And that will be awesome. And that will be the last week in this unit. But for now, take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and have a good week. Bye.